Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Ken Johnson, horticulture educator with University of Illinois Extension, coming to you today from Jacksonville, Illinois, with a Gardenbite. So this spring, in 2024, many of us skipped planting trees and shrubs because of periodical cicada emergence to avoid them being damaged by the cicada egg laying. However, now that we're approaching fall, we have an opportunity to plant some trees. So in this week's Gardenbite, we're going to take a trip back to 2022 when we had Emily Swihart on to talk about fall tree planting. We discussed what trees can be planted in the fall, some things we want to consider when selecting trees and when we're going to plant them, how to go about planting those trees, and how to care for them after planting. So enjoy this trip down memory lane. So we're coming up on fall, and one common thing we hear about in the fall is just a good time to plant trees and shrubs too, if we want to throw those in there. Is this actually the case? Fall is a good time, and why would that be or not be?
Well, it depends is the answer.
Next question.
Yeah. So fall is an excellent time to plant deciduous trees and shrubs. So those are the ones that would drop their leaves coming up into and going into a dormant season here in the winter. And it would be recommended to wait to plant those conifers that retain their leaves or their needles throughout the winter. And the reason for that is a little, it's related to them holding their leaves during the winter. So during our Midwestern winters, we have a lot of solar radiation, solar power that is still going to be hitting our plant materials. Without the leaves, dormant trees are not going to have the water demand that trees that are going to have their needles or leaves on the trunks or on the trees. That persistent leaf is going to continue to do some transpiration, especially on those days where the temperature warms up a little bit. This can stress the trees out because the ground has been frozen for a while, and so water is not available for those roots to deliver up through the tree into those leaves and replenish the supply. So that can be stressful, especially for newly planted conifers. Those trees that lose their leaves, deciduous trees, don't have that stress. And so they actually get a bonus season of root growth if you plant them here in the fall. So the above ground plant material is going dormant much sooner than our below ground plant material is going to be going dormant. The soils, by nature of having moisture in them, and then the material they're made of freezes a lot later in the season than what our ambient air temperature does. And so those roots are actually going to continue to grow for us and get established in the soil after being planted in the fall than they would be if we planted them in, say, April, which is probably the earliest many of us would be planting trees in the spring. And so the answer to, is it a good time to plant? Is it depends. Conifers, maybe wait or take extra precautions to protect them in the throughout the winter months. But deciduous trees is a really good time to plant right now, up through actually when the ground freezes. So get them in the ground.
So, Emily, I have diagnosed a lot of trees with like the chainsaw. It's like they call me up, they say, "Can you look at my autumn blaze maple? I mean tree." And I'm like, I look at them like, just gotta zik. Now, when we're planting trees, what are some of the things that we need to consider in terms of like just our yard? Like what type of conditions do we need to think about before we even put that shovel in the ground, so we don't have to pay $500 for some company to come cut it down for us?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. So thanks for asking it. In the arboriculture world, you'll often hear folks say, right tree, right place. It's a real catchy phrase that basically means like you need to do an appropriate and a proper site assessment to match the site conditions with the tree species that you are desiring to plant. You'd mentioned at the top of the show, these are plant materials that are extremely long-lived, and they're extremely valuable in our landscape, especially those really large species that take decades to reach maturity. You cannot replace that as quickly over a growing season or a couple of growing seasons, like say perennials, annuals, perennials, or shrubs. So the thoughtfulness that you're going to put into tree selection when you're planting it is worth the investment. It is worth the research. It's worth the study of your site. And so, at minimum, right tree, right place would be considering the available size of your landscape that the tree is going to be planted in, considering what adjacent site amenities are there. So is it being planted next to a house, next to a roadway, next to the utilities, overhead utilities, are those present? Other things would be, what is the soil like? So is it a native soil that is, loamy and rich in nutrients, or is it on a site that has been influenced by construction and have compacted soils or modified soils? There are tree species that are better able to tolerate some of those site conditions. And so knowing that about the soil can help influence your decision. Solar exposure would be another consideration. So is your site shaded, heavily shaded, moderately shaded, or is it exposed to full sun? Again, there are different species that have different tolerances for these site conditions. And so matching the species to the site is going to minimize your maintenance, but also give you a healthier, longer lived tree specimen over time. And then finally, to me, when you're planting a tree, you certainly want to match all of the site, prioritize matching the site conditions to the tree species, but then aesthetics. You'd mentioned like we were students of landscape architecture, like that matters to people, like how the tree is going to look. What are some of the characteristics that you desire in your tree? What are some of the functions that you want your tree to perform for you? So one of the main ones that I think we talk about, but doesn't always get maybe equated to trees so much, is habitat for pollinators, for wildlife. Trees are essential first foods for some of those early emerging pollinators. Without tree cover and tree canopies available for larvae, you can't have birds, the migratory birds, songbirds that we all enjoy. So if that's a priority for you, then picking species that are going to serve that purpose. Flowers, blooming trees are another aesthetic that people like, fall color. There's a whole variety of different things you can consider, but that's one that you would want to add to your list of criteria as you're looking at planting a tree.
So Emily, I often see a tree planted way too deep. So explain what are we talking about when we mean trees planted too deep? And why does this keep happening?
Yeah, it is a frustrating problem once you know what you're looking for. So from my observations and from my experience, the challenge originates in what we're getting from the nursery industry. A lot of the trees that we get are coming to us too deep, and I think that's just because of how our trees are produced. They're potted up year after year, and so soil is added to the root ball year after year. I'm not, blaming anybody. It just is a reality of how we have our trees grown, and so I think it's important for the public to be aware that when you purchase a tree from the nursery or the landscape industry, what you want to do is you want to look for what is called the first lateral root. And so you might have to actually dig out some of that soil material around the root ball to find what is a significant sized root on the root ball. And that is the level you want to plant the tree at or higher. So planting trees too deep can lead to all sorts of health problems. That essentially the trunk material that is typically above ground becomes below ground, and it's not meant to have the soil touching it, the constant moisture being on that bark material. It stresses the tree out. It can have, it can be a point of entry for pathogens into the tree, and can be a real, it can be an easily corrected, but often not corrected way to have a more healthy, viable tree in the long term. And so just digging down, taking off some of that root material or some of that soil material, and planting at the right depth can be critical.
So speaking of planting, I think we had mentioned this post-construction soil earlier when we were talking about site conditions. Let's say I got some lousy soil. Should I be making my planting hole, amending it, throwing a bunch of compost in there to give this tree a nice home?
So kind of, or it depends.
Okay.
So
that answer.
Back to that one. Ideally, in those conditions, we would go back to that right tree, right place. And so we would want to make sure that the tree species that we're trying to plant into those soil conditions can tolerate a harsher environment. And so A lot of times compacted soils, clay soils will either retain moisture, they don't drain as well, so it can be kind of soggy, can be a bit on the anaerobic side of things. And so some tree species will tolerate that well, some will not. And so that's the first place you would want to start. But then no matter what species you select, digging a big enough planting hole is going to be your first defense against how that tree gets established. Basically what you want to do is dig the hole about 3 times as wide as the root ball. And I know I have seen it. I have been that person that says like, oh, the soil is so hard. I need to get all these trees planted. It's hot, or I'm tired, or, like, let's just hurry up and do this. It is worth the investment of time and energy to dig that hole bigger. Again, these are very long-lived species. And so you kind of get one shot at planting them. Ideally, you plant it right the first time, and then you set the tree off on the right path. And so digging a hole that is 3 times as wide as the root ball itself is going to be the best way to help that tree get established in the site. You can do some soil modifications. A fertilizer is not recommended, so compost in there would not be overly recommended, because what you want to do is you want to encourage those roots to grow out into that native soil. Trees are massive, and that tree root system hopefully will be quite large and get established in that native soil, or that the surrounding soil. So sometimes if we make it too comfortable in our planting hole, the roots can tend to just concentrate there and have a harder time getting established outside of it. And so you could incorporate a little bit of sand if you wanted to help a little bit of drainage, but it's generally not recommended to do too much to the soil besides dig a bigger hole.
Yep, and I'm complaining the whole time while I watch my gardener plant those trees. So yeah, just kidding. I don't have a gardener. So amend the soil. Yeah, it depends. Likely not. We want that native soil to kind of be consistent across the board there. What about removing the burlap or the wire cage from the root ball? There's conflicting advice on this one. I mean, there's families that have been torn apart from this argument. It's just like the Civil War all over again. So should we leave the wire cage and burlap on?
It breaks my heart to hear that families have been torn apart over this. Well, let's try to set the record straight. It should be taken off. So a ball and burlap tree is one that is often field grown. And so you would use a spade, dig it out of a soil material. It's not in a container in the nursery. It would be grown into the actual ground. Burlap and the wire cages and put on it to maintain the integrity of that root ball. And then as it's transported to the site. Now, some of the challenges with that type of a root ball versus a container root ball is that you have a lot more loose soil around it. And so you don't want to take the root ball apart or take the burlap off or the cage off before you get it into the planting hole, because often it can just fall apart and then you have a massive bare root tree, which can be hard to deal with in terms of just the size of the tree that you're planting, because it was a ball and burlap. It's also requires a different kind of planting strategy, and those bare roots can dry out quickly, and so it can actually be detrimental to the tree. So you want to maintain the integrity of the root ball while you're planting it. So generally, you would dig your hole 3 times as large as you need to. Place the entire ball and burlap cage on. Use that to lift the tree into the hole, and then get down on your hands and knees and reach down into that hole as far as you possibly can with your wire cutters and your knife to remove that cage as low as you possibly can, and then cut off that burlap and remove it from the hole. I know the argument that burlap will deteriorate and that the wire cage does not impede root growth. Studies have shown that it can actually impede root growth. It can if the tree gets so large and the wire cage does not deteriorate, it can girdle the tree or the trunk, depending on the size and the placement. And then that burlap could deteriorate over time. It's just not a risk that we would want to take, because oftentimes there's a treatment on there that slows down the deterioration of it. And so you're investing a lot of time, energy, and often financial resource into planting balm burlap trees. Taking the additional step just to remove that cage and that burlap is going to be your best bet to ensure your trees establish as well.
Exactly. I'd say why someone said, well, that burlap will be gone in 5 years. Like, well, I don't want to wait 5 years for my roots to get in the ground. So
Yeah.
get it off right now. That's right. Yeah. So,
Yep.
All right. Last planting question for you, Emily. Let's say we plant our tree and we see the neighbors, everybody else, they stake their trees. So we gonna put some stakes in the ground for our tree. Should we not? What's the right answer here?
It depends.
Oh, it's another one of those. It depends.
So in a perfect world, you would not need to stake a tree, and the conditions that would help you make that decision would be the size of the root ball and the stability of the tree. And so, like I had mentioned earlier, hopefully you're just planting this tree once, getting it in the ground one time, and then the tree is going to be able to establish itself. Now, trees that don't have an adequate sized root ball on them, if the canopy is bigger than what the root ball is going to be able to accommodate in terms of stability, then you would want to provide some supplemental support for that tree while it's getting established and while the root system is getting redeveloped or developing for the first time, perhaps. With staking, you want to stake it loose so that the tree can do some movement. You don't want it to tip over, of course, and you want it to stay upright while it's getting established. But trees naturally need to develop some wind resistance, and so having a loose stake on the tree, if it is deemed necessary, so that the tree can sway in the wind, a couple inches to either side, is recommended. And then put on your calendar for a year later to come back and check it. You want to make sure and check it, more frequently than that, but hopefully within a year you can actually remove the stake if the tree has become established enough to support itself with its root system. I say check it often throughout the year to make sure that stake or that tie is not causing any damage to the trunk of the tree, because that movement and then the material that is chosen for those stakes can actually wear on the trunk, and that can be a point of a source of fungal infection, or you can actually just harm the tree, and we don't want that because we're trying to help establish our trees.
Yeah. So don't tie them up too long. Yeah, they're
well, and they're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to run away. Like, I've never seen a tree run away, so you don't need to tie it down forever.
Exactly.
One of the one value that I'd see stakes, not necessarily ties, but stakes playing in like a commercial landscape or in a landscape that is managed not by the person who planted the tree, or a heavily turf grass area, mowed area, is that it can deter mowers from getting near the trunk of the tree. Mulch is out really well too, but an iron post, a couple iron posts around a tree can really stop a mower from damaging the trunk of a tree. And so I will sometimes encourage folks to take the tie off and leave the stakes in the ground if they don't mind the visual of stakes in the ground, to just keep mowers away.
Yeah, mowers, they're about as bad as deer. They're terrible animals.
Yep, and spring trimmers.
If I can remember, I think Ken's editing this week. I'll send Ken a picture of a white oak tree that I visited, and the homeowners had no idea what to do because they had it staked for years. And when they took the stakes off, the tree literally just flopped over in the alleyway.
I'll try to send you a picture of a tie that was left on too long, and then the tree actually grew, in diameter, and started to encompass that. It's a rope material, which is also a weak point. You can create a weak point on the tree, and I've simply just snap off at that point over time.
Yeah, because not all of the rope or the burlap, not all that stuff is natural. Some of it's even synthetic, and it doesn't decompose no matter what we do or throw at it.
Yeah. Yep. One material that is pretty easy. So in my previous work that we talked about, I worked with volunteers in communities, and we would get grant money to plant trees, but then like all the support, stakes and whatnot would not be included in that grant. So we would seek donations. And one of the least expensive, fun, I guess, if you will, ways to tie a tree would be with the legs of old pantyhose. That material, it works pretty well in giving the tree some flexibility to move around. It will hold it upright, but it also deteriorates over time. Like it will just break down in the elements. And so you still need to go out and check it, but if you forget the tree, and I've seen people do it, forget, to go check on the tree for a year or two, that will oftentimes kind of just erode itself off of the tree. So
Keep that in mind.
while your old pantyhose.
I know what to use my hands for.
All right. So once we've got our trees in the ground, they're planted, we've taken that burlap and that wire off if we're doing balled and burlap. What should we do after that to help get them established and survive?
Yeah, so regardless of the season you're planting, spring or fall, mulch is recommended. And you want to put this on, I'm sure you guys have covered this before, but you want to put the donut shape of 3 to 4 inches of mulch around the tree instead of that volcano. Keep that mulch material off of the trunk of the tree, but mulch around the root ball. Bigger is better when it comes to mulch rings. In the woodlands where many of these trees develop, the whole entire root zone is covered in mulch, leaf material, that fell on the forest floor. And so if folks are willing and able, mulching all the way out to the drip line of a tree would be most recommended. But as much as you can afford or can tolerate, the bigger the mulching, the better. And that just helps maintain moisture into the soil. During the winter months here, as we're coming into the cold season, it's going to help moderate some of the temperature fluctuations as well, keeping that moisture in the soil. You're not going to have these massive temperature swings, which is going to help eliminate the chance of having frost heave. So your tree just getting shoved out of the soil because the ground is freezing and thawing. And so mulch is highly recommended, and doing it seasonally. Checking it now, making sure that your trees still have mulch on them, even if we did it in the spring, they might be okay, they might not. So check them again. And then water. We've had some good rainfalls up here of late, and so in northern Illinois, and so much of the soil has adequate moisture in it. That's not a guarantee throughout the rest of the autumn, and so making sure that we're providing supplemental water when the ground is starting to dry out. For newly planted trees as well as established trees.
Well, that was a lot of great information on planting trees in the fall. So again, make sure you're taking some time to consider how big that tree is going to get and where you're going to be placing that in your landscape. Make sure you're planting that, and make sure you're not planting that tree too deep. Make sure you've got that planting hole wide enough. If you're planting a balled and burlap tree, make sure you're removing as much of that burlap and that wire cage as you can. And then make sure you're taking care of those trees after you're done planting them. The Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by me, Ken Johnson. Thank you to all of our listeners listening to us on the podcast, or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing.